Some time ago, a friend of mine, who is a psychologist as well, told me about a case she had, which is almost perfect for today's topic, because she had the assignment to treat a 13-year-old girl with strong social anxiety. And this girl's social anxiety was really strong. She had almost no friends. She preferred to stay at home. When she went to school, which she did less and less, she almost never said anything because she was too afraid of being judged negatively. And especially getting grades at school was extremely hard for her because she was very afraid of getting bad grades. And therefore, at some time, she really did no longer go to school. And with this girl, my friend, she conducted a classical cognitive behavioral therapy. There were some cognitive reframings about whether all other people are really observing her all the time, this kind of spotlight effect that people with social anxiety often have. They have the impression that they are at the center of attention. This misinterpretation of the world was something that she was able to dissolve, for example, by some behavior experiments, but they also did some exposures. For example, the girl tried to go back to school and she even succeeded in saying something in class. And in fact, the therapy was quite successful. The symptoms became better and better, and it was not perfect, of course, but she was able to go back to school, and sometimes she even met with friends. But this success did not last very long. After some weeks, there was a quite strong return of the symptoms, and the girl again did no longer want to go back to school. But what finally led to a breakthrough was when the therapy became more systemic. So my friend began no longer to concentrate on the individual, on this girl and what behaviors or what thoughts could be changed, but she concentrated much more on the system, for example, on the system of the family, because there were some things going on. On the one hand, she found out that the mother herself had quite a lot of anxiety. She was at the edge of having a generalized anxiety disorder. So, for example, when the phone was ringing, she always was like, "Oh my God, what is happening now?" Or if somebody was ringing on the door, she was like, "Whoa, oh my God, what is going on?" You can imagine that just by watching somebody do this all the time, that via vicarious learning, you somehow get the impression that maybe the world is quite dangerous if people around you are behaving like that. This, of course, can have an influence on an upgrowing child. At the same time, both parents had a very overprotecting parenting style. So whenever obstacles were coming up, they took it away from their child. So if, for example, the child would have to call somebody, they very often did it for the child. So most of the difficult situations were solved for the child by the parents, which of course was done with best intent. But on the other hand, in this way, the child never went through this upward spiral of, okay, there is an obstacle, I can overcome it, and I am able to cope with these difficult situations, and therefore I can take the next step and then the next step. And in this way, the child learns that it can succeed in the world. The third problematic behavior in the system was that both parents were also quite critical towards the child. So, for example, when it came to school grades, they reacted with only little understanding. So, if the child had a 3 or maybe even a 4, in Germany, these are quite middle grades. The worst grade in Germany is a 6. So if the child did not bring home a 1, a very good grade, they were sometimes really disappointed because they wanted the best for their child. They wanted that their child gets good grades and can go to university and get a good job later. But they created a lot of pressure and were very critical towards their child, something they had learned from their own parents. So these 3 factors, overprotection, very critical, and vicarious learning of anxiety, contributed to the social anxiety. And think about it, even if a cognitive behavioral therapist works with the individual, works with the girl in this case, and she does some steps into the right direction, as soon as she comes back into the system, as soon as she comes back home, where she is so many hours, there are so many learning experiences, for example, in respect to vicarious learning of anxiety, which contradict, which are in strong contrast to the positive learning experiences. Therefore, the therapy became really successful when she invited the parents of the girl and they discussed all these problems within the system, and the parents began to change their behaviors. They were no longer that critical. The mother tried to be a better model in respect to her own anxiety behavior. So, for example, when the phone was ringing, she tried to stay calm, or if somebody was ringing on the door, she also tried to stay calm and relaxed. And they also gave up some of their overprotecting behavior, which meant that the girl had to cope with difficult situations from time to time on her own, and she really learned that she can do it on her own. And that finally led to the therapy success. But if you followed this channel, if you followed the podcast, you know that I'm not that much impressed by such single anecdotes, such single case studies, because maybe it was just by chance. Maybe there were other things going on. You never know without a randomized controlled study. Therefore, today I want to present to you a pilot study on treating social anxiety with systemic therapy, in which they compared the systemic therapy with the traditional CBT, the traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. And the study was conducted in my home country, in Germany, by Christina Hunger and colleagues. The participants in this case were adults with social anxiety. But one group was treated with systemic therapy, in which the big difference was indeed that they were allowed to invite significant others, which meant, for example, they invited parents or, for example, partners. Whereas in the cognitive behavioral therapy, the therapists always worked only with the individual. Some other elements that were different were, for example, that they took a look at the genogram, which meant that they also took a look at the family history. For example, if the father or the grandfather also had social anxiety. This is something that can be very helpful for the clients, because they realize, well, it's not just me who has this, but it's something that is within our family. And by the way, social anxiety is also widespread over the population. About 7% of all people, at least once in their life, have social anxiety. So you are not alone if you have it. And I had it myself for a very long time. And another aspect that was different from CBT was that they looked more into resources. So they also looked in the past, for example, in situations in which there were positive exceptions, for example, when a successful speech was given, or when it was possible to have fun with friends and to speak freely with friends and to have this free chit chat with friends. And in systemic therapy, they try to remind of these positive exceptions and to use these as resources for upcoming confrontations, because there were some confrontations in systemic therapy as well. They enacted some difficult social situations. And in fact, having the significant others with them during the therapy was also some kind of confrontation, because they had to tell face to face what they were feeling and open themselves, something that is very difficult for people with social anxiety. So maybe these were the factors that could have been effective in this therapy. And the therapy indeed was effective, because when they compared the results to the CBT, to the traditional CBT therapy, on average, the systemic therapy was not inferior, it was not equal, it was indeed superior. It was more effective than the usual CBT. And these results are really very interesting. Of course, it's just a pilot study at the moment. There will have to be bigger studies. There have been some studies in the past, but not that much on social phobia, much more on other psychological disorders, but not that much on social anxiety up to now. But for the moment, these results are very promising, and they tell us that as therapists or as somebody who is struggling with social anxiety, it can be very helpful to not only look at yourself, to not only look at the client and to try to solve the problems of the individual, but it can be very helpful to take a bigger look at the system in which the client is and in which you are, and think about how strong the impact of behavior changes from other members of the system can be. And sometimes you might also find that some disorders do only exist because they keep the system together. So for example, it can happen that there's somebody with anorexia or depression, and the parents who were for some time on the edge to getting divorced because they no longer harmonize with each other, they no longer match, but because the child is having these strong psychological problems, they try to stick together. So in this case, for example, the child is trying to keep the system together via this psychological disorder. So it can be very helpful to take a look at the full picture and not only to say, well, this one person is ill, we have to treat only this one person. No, sometimes there is some problem within the system. And for that, the so-called systemic therapy can be very, very helpful and effective. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you want, we will see you next time.